appreciate it. I suppose I should introduce you as @Kwajo Tweneboa, because that's how a lot of people know you through your pioneering use first of Twitter, or X as it's now kind of called, or Instagram and other kind of feeds as well. I've got a little list here. You have been on Good Morning Britain, you've been on Sky News, you've been in The Guardian, you're also rumoured to be on first name terms with Michael Gove and Sadiq Khan. Yeah. The last few years have been huge for you. Can you just tell us a bit about the story? Like, how did this come about?
Yeah, I mean, the last is 2.5 years now, and it's been absolutely nuts. And I live in social housing, I have lived in social housing, and my sort of what's happening now is from lived experience. So I go out advocating on behalf of people living in poor conditions, and that's because me and my family were living in poor conditions, and we was in social housing, experienced temporary accommodation, homelessness, all of those sorts of things. And when we did get our social housing, it had issues like cockroaches, mice, damp, mould, ceilings that caved in, issues that we experienced for years, and we had moved into those sorts of conditions, and we were just simply ignored by our landlord, our provider. My dad became ill, he had cancer, he was in those conditions, he was receiving medical treatment in those conditions, and in 2020, and January 2020, ended up passing away as a result of that. And I realised after that there were many people in situations just like my dad, and I was like, it's horrific, just your average person living in those conditions, but the fact we're subjecting vulnerable people, people that are ill, young kids, you name it, people with disabilities, mental health, to these conditions, I thought it was just unacceptable. No one would want to live in those conditions, and it was one of those things where I realised there is no argument here. It's obvious to anyone that what's happening is unacceptable, and it's something that hasn't existed for a year and a half that I've been going into homes, but for absolute decades, and I wanted to campaign on it.
So it's really interesting for me, because anyone who works in social housing is on Twitter kind of missed your stuff over the last couple of years. But this is quite a difficult interview for me, because on the one hand I work for a housing association, and I've always worked in social housing, and I'm unambiguous about that, and I'm unambiguous about the fact that I do it because, not because it's like particularly lucrative, because I kind of feel that by and large we sometimes get things wrong, but we're the good guys, But on the other hand, what I like about your stuff is the contrast is so stark. Yeah. So I suppose my question kind of is, do you take that balanced view of housing associations, that they're broadly speaking a force for good, or has your lived experience of it just led you to kind of think otherwise?
I mean, through lived experience and sort of through my own personal experience and experiences of others, it's not just housing associations, it's also local authorities too, but whenever anyone comes to me, it's because they are struggling, they're in a similar situation, it's been negative, and there's people that have struggled for years, and I've spoken to thousands of people up and down the country. And I have no doubt, because I've spoken to people that work in social housing and for housing associations that genuinely go into it because they care. And in a lot of the cases, I don't doubt that. But what stands out to me and sticks out to me is there's a huge problem here, and we cannot ignore it. People's lives are being put at risk, and we've seen over the last few years that people have died as a result of their living standards. People have been neglected. People have been treated like subhumans, basically.
So where does that get? So these are my colleagues, and a lot of time my friends as well, and I do think they're good people, and yet I'm equally unambiguous about the fact that I'm not denying it goes badly wrong. So in your experience, where and how does it go wrong?
I mean, it's failures at multiple levels, I think. At different parts of like an organisation, if we're looking structurally at a housing association or a local authority, in regards to communication, in regards to treating complaints, in regards to the way people are spoken to when they phone in with complaints, the way, I hate the word customers, I see them as residents and tenants are dealt with, but I think it goes further than that. I think it's a stigma issue that's existed for generations around social housing, and people can care about working in social housing, right? But if the leadership isn't translating that same sort of message, if it's a thing where I see a lot of the time on the websites of providers that they care about their residents, they care about the homes that they're living in, X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't necessarily translate to what I'm seeing on the ground, then it means nothing, and that you can be someone working for a housing association and genuinely care, but if everyone in the organisation isn't pushing that message, if that's not your priority, if you've lost your purpose, then it's simply not going to work. And I think that's what we've seen. Yeah, that's what we've seen. Yeah.
What I really like about your work as well is I think it's not just about housing; it's about powerlessness, and it's about giving people a voice within their organisation, which is something that we care very strongly about as well. And what I also like about your work is you don't shy away from the kind of broader intersectional political issues.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen you talk about the lack of representation of working class people in
Absolutely,
Parliament.
yeah.
Like you speak about the Sudan, you've spoken about Israel and Gaza and stuff like that. So I suppose my question for you is, like, in the professional campaigning world, people often kind of think, don't do that because you've got a particular cause and you're going to alienate people with your other views. But you've kind of given two fingers to that, and it's like, why? I suppose.
It's important if you've got a platform to speak up, I think, and there's so many issues out there that perhaps, and it's quite frustrating that people with a platform and other celebrities and influencers or people that are just on social media don't necessarily address. And I care about a lot of social issues, like, yes, at the moment I'm speaking about housing and the crisis within housing and social housing, but when it comes to people dying and people suffering, I feel like it's necessary for me to speak up, and I think absolutely everyone should. I'm very much someone that cares about and supports, not even, I think it's so cliche to say that, like, the underdog, but those that aren't represented, those whose voices aren't listened to. And I think it's necessary to stand up and say, right, regardless of what it is that I do, people are going to judge me on X, Y, and Z. And I never came into this for that. I didn't come into this to be liked. I didn't come into this to be liked by any politicians or anything like that. Couldn't care less about it. I do it because I think it's important to speak up on behalf of people when they are suffering, when they are struggling, and be able to go head to head with those in charge. And I've said I want to encourage others to do that, not just young people, but everyone to be doing that, regardless of the cause that you're advocating on behalf of. There's so many issues out there.
I mean, that's fascinating for me as well, because one of the things I really admire you for, and I normally try and keep my own politics out of this, but I'm going to allow myself this one exception, is you recently turned down an MBE, which stands for Medal of the Order of the British Empire, let's not forget. So that's kind of fine if you're talking to, like, the woke Twitterati or old school Republicans like me. Do you find that kind of stymies your ability to influence the world as it exists, politics as it currently exists?
No, I was asked that, interesting, and I had a feeling, I'll be honest, that it would come. Even after a year of campaigning, I knew this wasn't an issue that was going anywhere, and I had a feeling one day it may happen. I didn't expect it to be so soon. And like I said in the statement that I released, I appreciate whoever it is that did it, because I'm sure they did it out of the kindness of their heart. But I was very clear that I'm not here for awards, I'm not here for medals, I'm not here for titles or anything like that. At the end of the day, there's an issue here, and it's very much an ongoing issue. It's an issue that hasn't been dealt with, and I'm not gonna accept, well, in this case, an MBE, whilst there are record numbers of people on the streets. We're seeing increased numbers of child homelessness. We're seeing people, increased numbers of people rough sleeping, and people living in poor accommodations, people dying in their homes. I'm not gonna do that. And from the beginning, I've been clear on that, and people are going to judge me regardless. People have said in the past, especially when I was offered it, they were like, "Are you sure it's something that you want to do? Are you sure you want to turn it down? It's going to open a lot of doors for you. You should take it." But I was very determined, and I was very clear that over the last 2 years, I think at that point, I had done a lot of work, and I had worked really, really hard to try and build things up from the very bottom, and I had support from people very close to me, and people that I consider really, really good friends. I understood that people may think, like, it's going to open so many doors, maybe you shouldn't turn it down, but I believe that, and I still believe that, the doors that are supposed to be open are going to open regardless, and I'll be able to open them, and the doors that aren't supposed to open won't, regardless if I have a title, regardless if I have letters after my name. I don't care.
You said, "I cannot accept being honoured or receiving a title off the back of an issue which realistically should never have existed, and saying that, I feel compelled to turn it down." You then went on to challenge, really, the Prince and Princess of Wales. You thanked them as well, but challenged them to say they need to do more about social housing. Do you think that this issue is going to cut through at a national level in a way that, as we both have been saying, really, it hasn't done?
I hope so, and I believe so. I mean, I'm very determined, and I know there's other housing campaigners out there, there's other charities, there's shelters, Acorn, London's Renters Union, and housing is an issue that affects absolutely everyone in this country, whether you are a rough sleeper or you live in an absolute mansion. We've seen over the last year, even if you've got a mortgage, the housing crisis is affecting individuals, and it's something that has to be addressed. I think it hasn't been for as long as I've been alive, and even before that, especially in regards to social housing. and it's becoming worse and worse and a bigger issue to ignore politically. And yes, social housing may not be something that they believe is going to win a political party in election, but it's a growing problem. And the reality is, when people struggle in regards to housing, they rely on social housing. Doesn't matter if you have mortgages or you default on your mortgage, you lose your home. Doesn't matter if you live in the private rented sector and you can't afford your private rent, or you're kicked out because of Section 21, then you have to turn to social housing. We simply don't have enough. And it's something that I believe genuinely will cut through at a national level. And it's a shame, I think it's an absolute disgrace that after Grenfell, it wasn't something that cut through. And that 5 years on, I think it was 5 years or 4 years when I first started after Grenfell, myself and others were having to come out to disgrace providers and shame them because of the lack of progress. And not just providers, government and ministers too, for the lack of progress in regards to building safety, tenant safety and all of these other issues, quality of our homes. It should have been, and I really hope this is the moment that it will be.
I mean, speaking of moments, I think Grenfell, for everybody who, well, I was going to say everybody in housing, but actually just everybody who saw it. I still remember where I was that day.
Oh, I do, yeah.
You can't really do justice to it in terms of words, but it was transformative for you in terms of making you think about these things more?
Absolutely. I still remember where I was. I still remember my thoughts. At the time I was in temporary accommodation, it was a converted car garage, and it made me realise that there's a specific class of people and people within British society that just aren't treated fairly, aren't treated like human beings, aren't listened to or spoken down upon. And not even just Grenfell, even before that, the fact that we had shows like Benefit Street and How to Get a Council Home, I think is the title of it, and all of these shows with the negative stereotypes aimed at social housing tenants, when there was a real lack of understanding of who it is that lives in social housing, and this lack of admitting that they are still human beings first and foremost, that really angered me. And I'd say that was the beginning stage of the change in mindset for me and the realisation, and then my own situation on top of that was the catalyst for this is what I need to do.
So I think one of the really important things about campaigning around housing and issues like this is it's quite easy to kind of point out all the things that are wrong about it. And I think we also need to make sure that we've got a constructive solution to what could be done better. So, I mean, what would be your proposals along those lines? If you were in charge of, be it a housing association or a government department, what would you do differently?
Oh, there'll be loads of changes, I think, and we're seeing it. Changes to regulation, I think, is important. Although people are scared of the words regulation, I think in terms of protecting people's lives and safety, it's necessary. We have it in the NHS, we have it in education, we absolutely should have it in housing and social housing. There needs to be that level of professionalism too. In regards to government, it's clear what needs to happen. There needs to be an investment in housing in this country. There needs to be a national sort of building scheme. There needs to be investment in social housing first and foremost. And there has to be a bottom-up solution to tackling this housing crisis. It's all great and well us living in a time where we're pushing this idea, or I say where, government's pushing an idea of home ownership. We've pushed it for the last 50 years, and where has it got us? We're in a situation now where the rented sector is completely on its knees because it's been neglected for generations, and we have to get to a point where we realise perhaps things need to change, perhaps our direction and view needs to change, and actually we need to be dealing with the real issues, the issues that people care about, the fundamentals, the fact that people's lives are being jeopardised and put at risk, and that needs to be the priority over profit and pushing this agenda that a house should be a profit-making scheme, when in reality, no, we should not be looking at it like that. That's what's got us into the problem that we find ourselves in now. It's a necessity. It's a fundamental to the lives of absolutely every single individual, and everyone should have a right to have a roof over their head. That's how we should look at it, just like food and water.
But what would you say to those who would say, you're just picking on the guys who are trying to provide that? You're just shining a light on some of the people who are trying to make housing a necessity?
Well, I'm not. I wouldn't say that I am. The fundamentals to me, especially after Grenfell, is people's safety. And whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's housing, the safety of those receiving that service is priority above everything else. And especially within housing, that purpose has been lost. Especially within social housing, that purpose has been lost. Many tenants will say, I've spoken to thousands up and down the country, I've been in so many homes, I've lost count. And many people turn around and say, especially within social housing, they feel like their providers have become more of property developers than they have social housing providers, and they've lost their purpose.
But we do need new homes, don't
we?
We need to build new homes. And no one goes around and films lovely homes that people move into.
They do. I've seen quite a lot of that on social media, and my thing very much is, I'm always asked, well, do you have people reaching out to you with good stories? And my thing is, no, thousands of people are reaching out to me because of their poor stories, because they have been neglected, because of the way in which they're treated. And I've said in the past, and I've said it to housing providers, if we woke up tomorrow, right, and we saw on the news a breaking news story where tenants, patients were being neglected in hospitals across England and they were dying directly because of the negligence of employees, doctors and nurses, we wouldn't then turn around and ask, well, what hospitals are doing it right? What we want to know is which ones are doing it wrong and which ones do we need to avoid and where it is that we need to push for change and who do we need to hold accountable. And that is how I see my work. Like, yes, of course, there's going to be good stories out there. That for me isn't the focus, because at the end of the day, we could talk about the good stories, but at the end of the day, people are dying in their homes. And that's what I care about. No one should be dying in their homes whilst having to pay rent. No one should be freezing in their car because of homelessness, and that's what's happened recently. People shouldn't be, being in temporary accommodation for 10, 15 years that's in poor conditions, or being exploited because of that, or just treated like subhumans. But that is what's happening, and that's what we need to focus on above anything else in order to create real systemic change and make it clear that, yes, okay, there may be some good people, and I'm sure there are people working in the private sector, working in social housing, that do genuinely care. But we need to be of the same consensus, whether you're a campaigner or you work in housing, that's great, but there are people that aren't, and that isn't their priority, and there is no room in the sector or sectors for that. And whether you're a campaigner or you work in housing, we should be of the same consensus that that's what needs to be stopped in order to improve things for everyone. Tenants are the ones receiving the service, yet they're not receiving a great service at the moment. Again, it comes down to fundamentals, investment by the government, lack of funds by the government. But tenant safety and those receiving the service, those paying for a service that they're not receiving, should be the priority. Those are the voices that we need to be hearing from, because for a very long time we haven't heard from their voices, and that's why it's been allowed to get to the level that it is at the moment.
I think everybody can agree that we need greater involvement of residents in the way in which organisations are run. I want to ask you finally about your future plans. So we were talking about the fact that there's big political changes afoot. You know, are you running for Parliament? Do you want to be in a housing association board? How are you going to use this powerful base that you've built to actually bring in some transformative changes? I mean,
at the moment, my priority is definitely, like, I've been doing this for 2.5 years now, and I knew an election would be coming. When, I didn't know, but I know it's around the corner now. And my priority is making sure that housing is up there in the agenda. Again, it's one of those issues. We've prioritised all other sort of issues over elections over many, many decades. But housing, since World War II, I don't think, especially social housing, hasn't been a priority. And I think now is the time for it to be the priority, because things are only going to get worse, not just for tenants, but for the government too. Things are going to become more expensive if they continue to neglect this issue. But more importantly, people will continue to die. And if anything should have been the catalyst for change and making sure that was the priority, it should have been Grenfell. And I think it's a massive shame on politics and a massive shame on politicians that wasn't the time for change. That wasn't the time of realisation. And as a result, people have died since then, whilst having to pay rent. And that needs to be the priority, whether it's, well, first and foremost, it needs to be social housing, the state of the private rented sector. And we've seen, like, it doesn't matter what class you're from, whether you live in social housing or you own your own home, this idea that security and stability and affordability was why everyone needed to buy their own home and have that, has been proven in the last year to be fiction, really, because even if you've got a mortgage, we've seen what happened over the last year and a half. Housing affects all of us, and political decisions will affect all of us in relation to housing. That needs to be the priority. That's what's going to change and be the catalyst for change in regards to the economy and driving productivity. And I know that's what governments like, that's what politicians want to push for. You want to do that, you make sure that people are living in decent and safe and affordable homes, and that will change.
So last question, who are you voting for?
Oh, who am I voting for? That's a good question. At the moment, I am still questioning all sides of politics. I haven't really got the commitment that I would have hoped for, and I've made it clear that in the run-up to the next election, I'm not going to shy away from, regardless of what colour they wear, what side of Westminster they sit on. If they're not prioritising housing in the right way, it doesn't matter who I voted for, who my family have voted for in the past. I'm going to make that clear. So as of yet, I don't actually know. I don't actually know who I'm going to go with. Hopefully, as we get close to the election, I may see some positive commitments in regards to actually tackling the real issues when it comes to the housing crisis and housing emergency, and that will influence my decision. But as of yet, I don't know.
Kwajo, Tweneboa housing campaigner, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.